What is the plot of the Bible? Well, like all books, the Bible begins at the beginning, and the beginning is the first 11 chapters that we find in Genesis. And like all beginnings to all books, it introduces us to certain things. It introduces us to the framework of all that will follow. It introduces us to the main players, the main actors, if you like, in the drama, which we'll find unfolding over the next few thousand years. It introduces us to various concepts that are there. The Bible begins with this beginning and it sets the scene. The first thing that we find in Genesis is that God is a creator God. God created the heavens and the earth by speaking, and creation comes into being. That means that God has a certain authority over the things that he created. They are his creation, they're his to do with as he pleases. We find within that creation that Adam and Eve have a particular kind of place. They are there, the beginnings of the human race. They represent all of the human race, and we find that they are created in the image of God. And as being created in the image of God, they have a special relationship to God. But that image is marred somewhat at the fall. This is Genesis chapter 3, and this whole business with Adam and Eve and the fruit of the tree and the serpent. What do we see from this? Well, we see that we have then an Adam and Eve representing humanity, but they have fallen from their calling. They have fallen to temptation, and there is a disruption in that relationship between God and those made in the image of God, because those made in the image of God are now expelled from the Garden of Eden. There is a rupture that is there. Now, there are more things to be said, but that will do for now in the beginning. The next chapter then is the remainder of Genesis, where we start to see that God calls an individual person and seeks from that individual person to restore things. And that individual person is Abraham, or Abram as he's known at the beginning. And through Abraham, Isaac and Jacob, and then to Joseph, we have the history of how this person begins a family, that this family begins to grow, so that at the end of Genesis we find that we have Joseph in Egypt. He's gone south to Egypt in captivity, but he's risen through the ranks. He's now like the equivalent of the prime minister, if you like, of Egypt, and he is an important, influential person, and his family has come and joined him there, the brothers who sold him into slavery. And as Joseph is to comment at the end of the book of Genesis, you intended it for evil, but God intended it for good. We then leap forward quite some time, quite a few hundred years, to the beginning then of Exodus. And the picture is now somewhat different. The family who came down into Egypt, they've grown, but they are now an enslaved people. The Hebrews are there busily doing building works for Pharaoh, and they're crying out for help. And the instrument by which God rescues the people is Moses. Now, Moses was brought up in the royal household. He's a person of influence, but he's fled because he has committed murder by those who were against his own people, the Hebrews, and he's fled. But he's nonetheless used by God. Even though he's not a great speech maker, he's still used by God, and we have this escape from Egypt, the rescue of God of his people out from the slavery of Egypt through to the promised land. And this is pivotal, this is foundational for everything that follows. Because, as Moses said to Pharaoh, he wanted people to be free so that they may go and worship God in the wilderness. So that's the second foundational area. We've got the setting of the scene in the beginning. We've got the growth of this family who have now become tribes in Egypt. And we then have the rescue as a people are taken out of Egypt. And it's during that rescue that they then encounter God through Moses. Moses encounters God on Mount Sinai, and they are given the Ten Commandments, this foundational commandments and then other regulations that go with it. This is the law by which they are to live, because they are now a people who have been rescued by God out of Egypt into slavery. So they're no longer enslaved to Pharaoh, if you like, but now they are enslaved, or they are followers of God, and he now gives them the way in which they are to live. Now, there's a lot of going on in all of this, and it takes them a while because they are too afraid to go into the promised land originally. But they do eventually get to the promised land under Joshua. So we're now in the book of Joshua. We've dealt with the first 5 books. We're now in the book of Joshua, and this is the conquest of the promised land so that they may settle in the promised land. And as they settle there, then judges are raised up. This is the book of Judges, by which I mean people who are raised up to, well, judge the people. They are leaders, and they are seen as the wise people who give judgment on various things. They're very tribal at this stage. You've got 12 tribes, and they are scattered around through what we know as ancient Israel. They are independent tribes in that way, living together in this land under a common rule, but the temptation just to worship the gods of that land, Baal and others, is still strong, and we see them fall into that temptation over and again. But after a period of judges, they want to be like the other nations who've got kings. So they do eventually, and this is in Samuel, elect themselves kings, or not elect themselves kings at all. Rather, they are given kings because they demand kings. Now, let me just quickly recap. We've got, let's do some very rough chronology. This is very, very rough indeed. We've got Abraham at roughly 2000 BC. We've got Moses and the Exodus at roughly 1500-ish BC. We can be 100 years or 200 years either side of that, perhaps. And then we've got the kings. And this is 1000 BC, roughly. Now, this is King Saul. And then the greatest of the kings, King David. Think of the Star of David there on the flag to this day. King David, who wrote so many of the Psalms. Think of this great figure, King David. And he's the one who unites, really, the tribes under his generalship. He is the one who expands the boundaries of Israel more than they've ever been expanded before. He's the great warrior king, the great poet king, the man after God's own heart, the great hero. And then Solomon, who is wise, but not, I'm afraid, wise enough to be led astray by his many, many wives and his many, many concubines. And after Solomon, well, the kingdom splits in two. There, because we find that the unity that was held was only really held through the force of personality of David in many ways, and the northern 10 tribes separate off, and the southern 2 tribes coalesce around the successors of David in Judah. Judah is the southern part, and Israel, or Ephraim, is the northern part. And effectively, they are 2 different kingdoms. Yes, they are united by this same history, but in the north, they tend to worship God in different places, and they are seen really as people who've compromised. And, well, after about 300 years, they are conquered by the Assyrians in the 720s, about 722 BC. And, well, as they're conquered by the Assyrians then in the north, they are taken away. The way that the Assyrians dealt with this is they'd take people out of their conquered lands and put them elsewhere in their empire, and take people from elsewhere in their empire and put them in the conquered lands. That was it, really, from the northern 10 tribes, and all we're left with is the southern 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah, and they are very much based around Israel, around Zion and around Jerusalem. But of course, they themselves are not an unblemished record. They too have kings who lead them astray, and in the end they are taken into exile in about 586 BC. They're taken into exile by the Babylonians, where they will remain until 538 BC. Now, this taking it into exile was a tremendous shock to the system, because it was also the time when the temple was destroyed. And what does that say about gods? When the Babylonians with their gods come in and conquer us with our gods, Well, our God, even, just the one. What does that say about our God? Now, there have been visions of Ezekiel of the glory of the Lord leaving the temple before it was destroyed. God had really abandoned the people to their fate. They'd been handed over to their fate. And so this was a time of much soul searching. And when they came back, as I say in 538, when they came back, it was a time for them to try and rebuild and try to regroup. But they were always under foreign oversight. And we had periods of, in between the Old and New Testaments, of conquest of Alexander the Great and then the Roman Empire. But in this period too, a hope was growing and prophecies were given of somebody who might be of the line of David, that great king, and somebody who might lead the people, somebody who would be particularly anointed of God, a Messiah, which is just the Hebrew for anointed, or a Christ, which is just the Greek translation of Messiah. And there was a hope that this person would come from Bethlehem. All these things were recorded, and all these things were there in the Old Testament, that somebody would come back and sort it out. And so when Jesus is born at year 0, well, probably 6 BC, as Jesus is born, he is somebody in whom all these hopes come together. He's from the right tribe. He's from the right lineage. He's born in the right place. He's beginning to fulfill all these prophecies. And more than that, he's also working these great miracles, or signs as they're called in John's Gospel. And the point of these miracles is there to attract your attention. Now, I know when I start to talk about miracles, people will say, yes, the miraculous things don't happen, and that is the point of them. That's why they're eye-catching, because they are impossible. And the point of them is they point to who Jesus is. That if somebody can work these great things, which are impossible, and if Jesus can have mastery over creation, well, maybe as he's being described as the Son of God, he's more than simply human. We know of his human lineage, but maybe there is more going on. And so we find that when he dies upon the cross, that he can enact this great sacrifice. Echoes of the sacrificial system in the Old Testament, which I didn't go into, where sacrifices were offered on Mount Sinai at the temple for the sins of individual people. Well, now we find on the Mount, we find that Jesus is sacrificed so that he may carry the sins of all those who place their trust in him. And so we find that Jesus is the fulfillment of all of this, which is why there's so many mentions of the Old Testament. You see, it's important to see that the plot line begins, yes, there in Genesis, but it works through into the New Testament. Jesus is to be found in the Old Testament, in prophecy and in type, so that when we get to the New Testament, we can understand who he is, because we know how sacrifices work now, because we know what sort of person is being looked forward to. And when he rises and shows the divine Amen to all that he did, as he demonstrates his divinity, as he ascends into heaven so that he can begin that new uniting with God, which we can share in as we place our trust in him, well, then the rest of the the New Testament are the accounts of people bearing witness to that and explaining that. And so we have letters which are written to various churches, usually written in response to something, not always, but usually in response to some problem. And then we have the book of Hebrews, which would appear to be a sermon preached to Jews, but it's wonderful because it shows us how the Old and New Testaments coalesce together, how Jesus fulfills so much of the Old Testament, in fact, all of it. And then we have the book of Revelation, which looks towards the great hope that we have to come. And that really is the Bible. There's an awful lot more, of course there is. It's a long book, there's plenty in it. But that's the basic framework of it. That's the basic plot line of it. So as we read through it, we need to understand that we're not just taking things out of context, but it's part of a whole plot. Like in any murder mystery, you need the plot going from the beginning. The clues are there at the front. And that is the plot of the Bible. And that is how we understand it as we start to read through it.